"You people never learn." The words dripped from his mouth like venom as Julian Thorne leaned back in his chair, smirking, swirling the wine in his hand. Then, without warning, he flung the glass sideways. It shattered against the edge of the table, crimson liquid spraying across Naomi's crisp white blouse. Her body jerked, drenched in wine, shards of glass scattering across the polished floor. The room froze. A spoon clinked to the ground. Somewhere, a baby whimpered, but no one moved, not even her. Her arms hung still by her sides. Her gaze didn't flinch. He didn't stop there. "You're lucky I didn't throw the bottle," he sneered, brushing invisible dust off his suit like her presence had dirted the air. "People like you were made to serve." Gasps rippled in silence. But Naomi didn't speak. She didn't need to, because what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the woman he just tried to humiliate in front of everyone was about to become his boss. The Elysian Grand wasn't just a restaurant. It was the crown jewel of Kingsford's elite, the kind of place where wait lists stretched months and diners whispered instead of spoke. The chandeliers were made of imported Murano glass. The floors shined like mirrors, and the air itself seemed filtered through pride. Naomi Carter had walked into that world just an hour ago. Her name tag read, Naomi, server, pressed neatly onto a freshly laundered uniform. She stood tall, with calm eyes and a polished demeanor. To everyone else, she was just another new waitress learning the ropes on a slow Wednesday night. But the truth, tucked beneath that modest uniform and composed face, was far more complicated. Naomi held a business degree from Columbia University, graduated top of her class, and once ran a Michelin-starred kitchen team in D.C. before walking away from it all. No one at the Elysian Grand knew that. Not yet. And that was by design. 2 weeks earlier, she'd arrived in Kingsford with a duffel bag and a quiet mission. Her father, once a celebrated restaurateur, had been forced into early retirement after a corporate buyout buried his last establishment. He hadn't lost his passion, just his will. Naomi had watched it all unfold. The way her father's shoulders slumped lower each time another letter from the bank arrived. How the spark in his voice dimmed when he talked about food. How he no longer mentioned the name of the restaurant that once bore his initials. She hadn't come to Kingsford for a fresh start. She came for restoration, but she knew she couldn't fix a legacy by kicking down the front door in a power suit. Not here. Not in a world built on whispers and tradition. So, she made a decision. She applied under a different name. No LinkedIn, no resume, just a clean shirt, a borrowed address, and a job opening listed for minimum wage. It wasn't pride. It was strategy. If you want to understand how this place really works, her mentor had once told her, you start from the floor. So that's exactly what she did. While other diners admired the Art Deco fixtures and imported wines, Naomi took mental notes. Who barked orders without eye contact, who tipped well, who mocked the staff when they thought no one was watching. The Elysian Grand was beautiful on the surface, but beneath it, under the glass, behind the smiles, there was rot. And if she was going to help rebuild something better, she needed to see where the cracks were. Her father didn't know the full plan. He'd been skeptical when she first told him she was moving to Kingsford, let alone applying for a waitressing job at a place he used to supply fine cuts of meat to. You've built your own name, he'd said gently. Why start from someone else's bottom? But Naomi had looked him in the eye and said, because I want to know what they hide from people like us. That silenced him. The last thing he gave her was a piece of advice, one she'd carried every step into the restaurant. The higher they rise, the more they forget who holds the ladder. She hadn't come to the Elysian Grand to spy. She came to remember, to feel what it was like to be invisible in a place dripping with status, to move through halls where money talked louder than names, where uniforms stripped away humanity, and to understand what needed to change. On her first day, she swept crumbs no one saw fall. She wiped down menus smeared by careless hands. She stayed late, arrived early, and let the staff think she was just another hired desperate to hold onto the job. No one questioned her presence. No one saw the fire beneath the politeness. And no one, not even the season 4 manager, suspected that Naomi Carter had come to reclaim something bigger than a paycheck. She'd observed everything with quiet precision. The way Arthur, the manager, never made eye contact with Julian Thorne. How the other waitstaff stiffened when his name appeared on a reservation list, even though he never actually made one. Julian didn't need to. His wealth gave him an open-door policy. He arrived when he pleased, demanded what he wanted, and left a trail of insulted staff in his wake. Naomi had read about men like him, but reading wasn't the same as standing in front of him, heart-pounding, while he clicked his tongue at her like she was furniture. When she first saw his name whispered among servers, she didn't react. But when she saw the fear in their eyes, the way they warned her not to make eye contact, not to bother correcting him, she understood. This wasn't just about one man. This was about a system that allowed cruelty to pass as customer service. So when the wine hit her shirt that night, when a room fell silent and all eyes landed on her soaked blouse and clenched jaw, she didn't just stand there as a humiliated server. She stood there as a woman who had decided, weeks ago, that she would face men like him head-on, because eventually someone had to. Julian Thorne didn't even look up when Naomi approached his table. He was swiping through his phone, eyes glued to the screen like the world around him barely deserved acknowledgement. "I want the filet," he muttered. "Medium, and if it's overcooked like last time, I swear to God I'll make someone cry again." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of threat. Sharp, practiced, cruel. Naomi blinked, notebook steady in her hand. "Noted," she said evenly. That made him glance up for the first time. His gaze narrowed, assessing her like a product he might return. "New." "Yes, sir." He clicked his tongue with mock disappointment. "HM, you people don't last long." Naomi's lips tightened ever so slightly. "Excuse me," he scoffed. "Don't get emotional. Just bring the food and keep quiet." She turned without a word, heels clicking back toward the kitchen. But her silence wasn't submission. It was strategy. She would not let his bait drag her down. Not yet. Minutes later, she returned to his table with a glass of wine. She placed it gently before him. He lifted it with flair, took a dramatic sip, and then spat it back into the glass like it was poison. The stem of the glass slammed against the table with a sharp crack. Several diners flinched. Julian's voice rose like a knife through velvet. "Are you stupid or just blind?" Conversations nearby evaporated. All eyes turned toward Naomi. He jabbed a finger at the glass. "This is Syrah. I asked for Malbec. Do you even know the difference?" Naomi kept her voice low but steady. "You asked for Malbec. The bottle you pointed to is Syrah. I tried to clarify. Don't argue with me." He barked, loud enough to cut across the entire dining room. "I've had dogs that listen better than you." Gasps rippled. One man across the room shook his head. A couple whispered. Naomi stood motionless, her cheeks flushed, not from shame, but from restraint. And Julian grinned, victorious, reveling in the attention. But it wasn't enough. Just as Naomi turned to walk away, his hand snapped forward. The wine glass arced across the table. Too fast to dodge, too deliberate to mistake. It shattered against the edge. Red wine exploded across her white blouse. Shards of glass rained to the floor. The room inhaled sharply as the silence deepened into something electric. Naomi didn't flinch. She stood drenched, breathing through clenched teeth, a single drop of wine rolling down her temple like a tear. She didn't wipe it away. Julian leaned back, flicking his hand like he was swatting away an insect. "I'll be expecting a refund," he said coldly. "And a manager. You're done." His voice sliced through the hush like broken glass. Naomi stood her ground, the front of her shirt dripping crimson, but her eyes locked onto his with unwavering focus. Slowly, she stepped forward. One hand rested calmly on her hip, the other raised, not in anger, but in assertion, as she pointed a single finger toward him. "You're right," she said clearly, her voice firm, loud enough to carry. "I am done." The smirk on Julian's face twitched. I've cleaned up after men like you my whole life. Men who think their money is a license to spit on dignity. You break people because you're broken. You humiliate staff to feel powerful. But all it shows is that you've never earned respect. Only bought fear. His mouth parted, stunned. Around the room, forks hovered mid-air. Denise froze. No one moved. And Naomi, still soaked in red, didn't stop. I'm not afraid of you, Mr. Thorne. I've been homeless. I worked 3 jobs. I watched my mother scrub hospital floors at midnight and still come home smiling. And I'll be damned if I let some man who throws tantrums over wine make me feel small. The kitchen doors swung open. Arthur, the manager, rushed onto the floor, face pale, breath uneven. Naomi, what's going on? He asked, eyes darting from her drenched blouse to the shattered glass at Julian's feet. Julian shot upright, his voice sputtering with righteous indignation. This waitress just insulted me. I want her fired. Now. Arthur looked torn, frozen between the powerful man whose name meant full tables and the trembling woman whose eyes still blazed with something unbreakable. I'll go get the owner, he mumbled, almost to himself. Julian's grin returned like a reflex. Please do. Naomi didn't move. Not a step. What none of them knew, what Julian couldn't possibly imagine, was that the owner had already seen everything. That smug confidence in Julian's stance, the assumption that power would shield him again, only made the silence heavier. He turned toward her with a sneer. You'll be out of here before dessert, girl. Hope you're good at scrubbing sidewalks. Naomi stood soaked, her chest rising slowly, steadily, but her eyes never dropped. Around them, the room remained suspended in collective breath. Phones appeared, quietly recording. Somewhere, a spoon clinked against porcelain. But Naomi, she didn't blink. Then a voice, calm but deep, cut through the tension like a low roll of thunder. I think that's enough. Every head turned. From a corner table near the fireplace, a tall man stood. His hair was salt and pepper, combed back with quiet elegance. He wore no tie, just a simple gray blazer, and he walked with the stillness of someone long used to command. Julian's sneer faltered as the man approached, his calm presence somehow louder than any raised voice. Mr. Hastings, Arthur stammered, stepping aside. Even Naomi straightened slightly. She had seen a man once in a framed photo by the host stand, but never in person. Edward Hastings, owner of the Elysian Grand, the founder, the legend. Julian chuckled nervously, gesturing toward Naomi like she were some child caught misbehaving. Finally, thank God someone reasonable is here. But Edward didn't respond right away. He glanced down at the wine-soaked blouse, then at the shattered glass, then back to Julian's smug expression. Mr. Thorne, he said slowly, his voice measured and quiet. I watched this entire thing unfold from the moment you arrived tonight. That was when Julian's confidence cracked for the first time. Julian's brow furrowed. Then you saw how she disrespected me, he said, voice louder than necessary, trying to reclaim ground he didn't realize he'd already lost. But Edward didn't flinch. No, he replied, his tone firm but even. I saw how you humiliated her. Deliberately, publicly, repeatedly, just as you've done to nearly every server who's had the misfortune of working your table in this restaurant. A ripple moved through the room. A collective murmur, the subtle shift of shoulders straightening, of guests beginning to realize they'd witnessed more than a dispute. Julian blinked. Excuse me, I've tolerated your behavior, Edward continued, because of your name, your influence, your business connections. But tonight was different. Tonight crossed the line. He turned to Naomi, who stood frozen, eyes wide but clear. You, on the other hand, spoke with the kind of truth this place has needed for a very long time. Naomi's breath caught, and for the first time since the wine had touched her shirt, her posture softened. Julian, meanwhile, looked like he'd swallowed ice. You're siding with her, he snapped. A waitress who just publicly insulted a loyal client. Edward's gaze didn't waver. No, he said, I'm siding with dignity. Edward turned, letting his gaze sweep across the entire restaurant. Every pair of eyes followed him. Servers frozen mid-step, diners holding their breath. I started the Elysian Grand with nothing but a borrowed checkbook and my grandmother's recipes, he said. This place was meant to be a haven, a home for excellence, not ego. His voice remained low, but its weight silenced even the whispers. But somewhere along the way, we let that vision get hijacked. We let the powerful stomp on the people who make this place what it is. His eyes returned to Naomi. You reminded us of who we are. Then he looked to Arthur, who was still standing nearby, hands awkwardly folded in front of him. Give Naomi the floor manager position. Effective immediately. There was an audible gasp. From the staff, from the guests, even from Naomi, who blinked in disbelief. Julian took a step forward, incredulous. You can't be serious. Edward nodded. I'm very serious. Julian's voice climbed. You're awarding a woman who just disrespected me. I'm acknowledging a woman who had the courage to speak the truth when no one else would. Edward replied calmly. That's the kind of leadership I want on my floor. Naomi's lips parted, speechless. Her hand was still trembling, but for the first time all night, it wasn't from restraint. It was from relief. Julian's face flushed with disbelief. So that's it? You're firing me as a client? Edward didn't blink. Yes. You're banned from the Elysian Grand. The words landed like a gavel. Julian's jaw dropped open. You can't do that. I can't, Edward said simply. And I just did. For a moment, Julian looked around the room, as if expecting someone, anyone, to come to his defense. But there was only silence. No server stepped forward. No manager scrambled to smooth things over. The guests who once cowered before him now stared with quiet curiosity. Some with satisfaction. Naomi didn't move. Her shirt still clung to her skin, sticky with drying wine. But her eyes stayed locked on his. She wasn't shaking anymore. Across the restaurant, one table began to clap, then another. It wasn't a standing ovation. It wasn't loud or theatrical, but it was real, a recognition, a release. And Julian, for once, had nothing to say. No grand exit, no final insult. He simply turned and walked out, the echo of his expensive shoes swallowed by the stillness he left behind. No dessert, no apology, just silence. And Naomi, she remained standing, shoulders square, heart racing, but freer than she had felt in years. An hour later, Naomi stood in the back office. The door was slightly ajar, letting in the muffled hum of the kitchen, rediscovering its laughter. She had changed into a clean blouse, her apron folded neatly on the desk beside her. The air smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and rosemary bread. Across from her stood Edward, holding a folder labeled management. It wasn't fancy, just a plain manila envelope with her name scribbled on a sticky note. But in Naomi's eyes, it might as well have been a crown. Edward handed it to her gently. I know you didn't come here looking for a fight, he said. Naomi nodded, but I wasn't about to let someone throw wine at me and walk out smiling. Edward's face broke into a rare smile. That's why you're staying. She hesitated, fingers hovering over the folder's flap. You're sure? You gave everyone in this place permission to breathe, he said. You did more than stand up for yourself. You stood up for every person who's ever swallowed their pride because they thought they had to. Naomi blinked, the weight of his words settling in. For the first time since she stepped through the front doors of Elysian Grand, she felt seen, not just as staff, but as a force. By morning, the story had already outgrown the restaurant walls. Someone had posted the video, grainy, shaky, filmed from behind a vase of orchids, but unmistakably powerful. It showed Naomi, soaked in wine, standing tall, refusing to shrink beneath Julian Thorne's arrogance. The clip was barely 90 seconds long, but spread like fire. Within 24 hours, it had racked up over 2 million views. The caption read, "She finally said what we were all thinking." Comments flooded in. She's a hero. Why do the rich think they own decency? Edward Hastings did the right thing. Respect. She better be running that place by next week. News outlets picked it up. Morning talk shows discussed it. Podcasters analyzed every word Naomi had spoken. Some commentators called it a tipping point in service industry culture, a moment when a script flipped. And Naomi, she didn't post anything. She didn't do interviews. She just showed up the next day, tied her apron, and got to work like nothing had changed. Except everything had. The staff looked at her differently, not with distance or suspicion, but with quiet awe. Even the head chef, a gruff man with years of bark behind the stove, nodded once and said, "Glad you're still here." And that was all she needed. Julian, meanwhile, discovered that silence could be louder than outrage. Within days, two of his biggest business sponsors announced they were severing ties with his firm. The statements were brief, but brutal. "We do not condone patterns of public abuse. We prioritize integrity in all our partnerships." News segments replayed the clip alongside glossy stock images of Julian skyscrapers. But now, those images looked like monuments to ego. His name, once spoken with reverence in real estate circles, became a warning. Articles with headlines like "The Fall of a Bully Tycoon" and "From Penthouse to Pariah" dominated the feeds. Anonymous staff from other restaurants came forward, sharing eerily similar stories. Unpaid bills berated servers, threatened managers. And suddenly, Naomi's stand was no longer a one-off moment. It was a spotlight, a mirror, a reckoning. Julian tried to release a statement through a PR firm, something about a misunderstanding blown out of proportion, but landed flat. The public had already decided. He wasn't just the villain in one story. He was the symbol of an era people were done tolerating. While his empire staggered under scrutiny, Naomi walked through the Elysian Grand's doors, each evening with her head high and her name, now etched on the floor manager's schedule. The tables had turned, literally. Back at the Elysian Grand, everything felt lighter. The staff no longer hunched when certain names appeared on the docket. Jokes returned to the prep station. Smiles felt less rehearsed. Naomi didn't take over the restaurant with bravado or authority. She led by noticing, by listening, by remembering the names of the busboys and the favorite shifts of tired line cooks. One afternoon, she walked through the front entrance for the first time, not the employee door. That's when she saw it. A small gold plaque mounted near the host stand. Polished, simple. It read, "Respect is the dress code." Beneath it, "Manager, Naomi Carter." She stared at it for a long moment, then tucked a stray curl behind her ear and stepped inside. She didn't become rich. She didn't chase fame. But what she earned was something deeper. Freedom. Freedom from silence. Freedom from shame. Freedom to speak. Not in anger, but in truth. And for every person who had ever felt small in the shadow of someone loud, Naomi's story offered something rare. Proof. Proof that courage doesn't always look like shouting. Sometimes it looks like standing still while the world finally listens. And that, more than anything, was her triumph. The next weekend, a woman in a navy coat walked past the restaurant's front window. She paused, eyes flicking toward the gold plaque by the door. She lingered a moment, then pulled out her phone and snapped a picture. Later that night, she posted it with a caption. She stood her ground, and they honored it. It went viral again. But Naomi didn't react. She had no PR team, no branding strategy. What she had was a shift to cover, a staff to support, and a dining room to lead. Edward watched it all unfold from a quiet distance. He'd taken a step back from daily operations since the incident, letting Naomi find her rhythm. And she had. She never asked for authority. She simply embodied it. When Edward finally approached her one evening, it was with 2 cappuccinos in hand and a tired smile. "You ever think you'd end up here?" he asked. Offering 1 cup, Naomi chuckled softly. "Not like this. You've changed the place," he said. "And not just the rules. The temperature, the air feels different." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked out over the dining room, where a former dishwasher now trained a new hire, where a server laughed openly with a table of regulars. "I didn't change it," she said. "We did." Before leaving that night, Naomi walked once more past the plaque near the entrance. She ran her fingers lightly over the engraved letters, not out of vanity, but as if grounding herself in the moment. A guest was holding the door open for his elderly mother. A teenage hostess was laughing with a couple she'd just seated. It wasn't perfect, but it was better, and it was becoming more human by the day. The restaurant didn't suddenly become a beacon of justice or a media darling. It simply returned to what it was meant to be, a place where people came to feel welcome, and a woman who had once stood in silence, wine dripping down her blouse, now stood with a voice that didn't need to shout. It needed only to be steady. That was enough. Naomi didn't leave a speech behind. She left something quieter, a culture, a standard, a reminder that respect isn't handed down by rank or bought with tips. It's chosen, every day, and somewhere across town, in a high-rise office with empty calendars and unanswered calls, Julian Thorne sat alone, watching the world go on without him. His power had once been fear. Naomi's was truth. And in the end, it was truth that people remembered.